The wind was a thief on the day they buried Abram. It stole the warmth from Alara's shawl and the salt from her tears, leaving only a dry, chapped ache on her skin. It was a plains wind, relentless and indifferent. The same wind that had scoured the paint from their small farmhouse and cracked the soil in the fields until it resembled the lines on an old woman's hand. Her own hands, clasped tight in her lap, were a testament to that same unforgiving earth. She was 42, a widow now, with 3 daughters and not a single son to show for 2 decades of marriage. This fact was a heavier shroud than the black wool she wore. It clung to her, a suffocating garment of public shame and private failure. Her husband's brother, Gideon, stood beside the raw wound of the grave, his words of eulogy as thin and sharp as shale. He spoke of Abram's hard work, of his legacy. But his eyes, when they flickered to Alara, spoke of something else entirely. Barren ground. 3 times she had given him a daughter, and in the eyes of this land and its people, that was the same as giving him nothing at all. After the last shovelful of dirt fell with a hollow thud, the small gathering of neighbors dispersed, their condolences as brittle as autumn leaves. Only Gideon and his wife remained, their presence a looming shadow over Alara and her girls. Leah, the eldest at 17, stood ramrod straight, her young face a mask of fierce denial. Mara, 15, wept silently into her hands, while little Cora, only 10, clung to Alara's skirt, her knuckles white. "The farm will need a man's hand, Alara," Gideon stated, not asked. It was the opening salvo in a war she knew she could not win. Abram left debts. The bank. He let the word hang in the air, a vulture circling. "It is our family's duty to see to his name. My son, Jacob, will take over the planting." Alara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she had not moved. He was not offering help. He was delivering a verdict. They were being erased. Her life's work, the calluses on her hands, the sweat shed under the summer sun, the nights spent worrying over a sick calf or a coming frost. It all amounted to nothing. She was simply the vessel that had failed to produce an heir, and now her purpose was complete. "And us?" The question was a whisper, torn from her throat by that same thieving wind. Gideon's wife, a woman whose face was permanently pursed in disapproval, finally spoke. "There is a room for you and the girls at the back of our house. You can help with the mending. It is only right, a charity case." A seamstress living on the scraps of her own life. Alara looked from their hard, righteous faces to the worried eyes of her daughters. She saw their future shrinking, becoming a small, airless room filled with the scent of pity and stale bread. Despair was a cold, physical thing, settling deep in her bones. It was then that the sound of a heavy wagon, the slow, deliberate tread of a large horse, broke the suffocating stillness. A man dismounted, his form broad and solid against the pale, washed-out sky. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of immense strength held in reserve. It was Silas Cole, a rancher from the high country, a man who kept to himself and was spoken of in town with a mixture of respect and suspicion. He was a widower, they said, who had lost his own family to fever years ago and had since become a creature of solitude and silence. He held his hat in his hands, his dark hair ruffled by the wind. His face was weathered, carved by sun and sorrow, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, bypassed Gideon completely and settled on Alara. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, unpitying acknowledgement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "I heard about your husband," Gideon bristled, stepping forward. "This is a private family matter." Cole Silas's gaze did not waver from Alara. He saw the tremor in her hands, the stark terror in her eyes, the way she shielded her youngest with her body. He saw not a failed wife, but a cornered animal protecting her young. He took a slow step forward, the dust settling on his worn boots. He ignored Gideon as if he were nothing more than a fence post. His words were not loud, but they carried with a weight that silenced the wind itself. "I have a cabin on my land. It is empty, clean water in the well and wood enough for the winter. There is work, if you want it. Alara stared at him, unable to process the offer. It was an impossibility, a crack of light in a sealed tomb. Gideon scoffed, a raw, ugly sound. She will be cared for by her own. She is not some vagrant for you to. The word hung, unspoken but understood. Silas finally turned his head, his gray eyes turning to chips of ice. The look was not angry. It was something far more unnerving. It was a look of absolute dismissal. He turned back to Alara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He saw the shame Gideon was trying to heap upon her, the public degradation. He saw her pride, flickering like a dying candle. He spoke the next words quietly, meant for her and her alone, yet they seemed to echo across the barren churchyard. There is no shame in honest work, and there is no debt in honest help, he said. He paused, letting her truly see him, letting her weigh the crushing certainty of her brother-in-law against the terrifying uncertainty of a stranger. I will take you home. It was not a question. It was a promise. And in the desolate silence of her life, it sounded like a prayer. The journey away from the farm was a silent amputation. Every turn of the wagon wheels severed another route, another memory. Alara sat stiffly on the hard plank seat beside Silas Cole. Her daughters huddled amidst their meager possessions in the wagon bed behind them. They had packed what they could carry. Linens worn soft with use, a cast-iron skillet, the girls' few books, and the heavy, silver-backed mirror that had been her mother's. Leaving it behind felt like leaving a part of herself to be picked over by strangers. As they passed through the small town, she kept her gaze fixed forward, feeling the weight of peering eyes from behind curtains and in shop doorways. She could hear their whispers carried on the wind, sharp and speculative. The widow Miller, run off with that brute from the hills. No shame. The words were barbs, catching on the raw edges of her grief and humiliation. Shame was a familiar companion, but this new strain felt different, sharper. She was not just a woman who had failed to bear sons. Now she was a woman who had abandoned her station, her respectability, for the dubious protection of an outsider. She risked a glance at the man beside her. Silas drove the wagon with a steady, practiced hand, his shoulders a bulwark against the world. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since they had left the churchyard. He had simply helped Leah load their trunk, his movements sure and unhurried, his presence a silent counterpoint to Gideon's sputtering rage. Gideon had followed them to the edge of the farm, his face mottled with fury. You will regret this, Alara. You shame Abram's name, taking charity from that half-wild hermit. Alara had not answered. She had simply climbed onto the wagon, her spine straight, and had not looked back. Now the silence in the wagon stretched, thick and heavy. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of two strangers bound by a desperate circumstance, each uncertain of the other. Alara studied his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land as if it were a book. He was not a handsome man in the way Abram had been, with his easy smiles and ready charm. Silas was a man carved from harder material, shaped by solitude and loss. There was a severity to him, a self-contained stillness that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. She was acutely aware of her daughters behind her. She could feel their fear, a palpable thing that rose from the wagon bed like heat. Leah was trying to be brave, her silence a brittle shield. Mara was no doubt lost in her own sorrowful world, while Cora was likely watching the familiar landscape of her childhood recede with wide, uncomprehending eyes. A wave of guilt, so powerful it threatened to drown her, washed over Alara. What had she done? Had she traded a slow, respectable starvation for a swifter, more dangerous one? This man was a stranger. She knew nothing of his temper, his habits, his heart. She had placed the lives of her children in the hands of a ghost story, a man the town whispered about but did not know. The flat plains began to give way to rolling hills, the landscape growing wilder, more rugged. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a track. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. This was his country, and it felt like another world entirely. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Still, Silas did not speak. The silence began to feel less like a void and more like a language she did not yet understand. He did not ask her questions, did not pry into her grief or her fear. He simply drove, his presence a steady, quiet constant. Finally, as twilight settled, he pulled the horse to a halt. "We'll make camp here for the night," he said, his voice startling in the quiet. He dismounted and began unhitching the horse with the same fluid efficiency he did everything. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Alara felt a surge of helplessness. She did not know what to do, what was expected of her. At her old home, the rhythms of her life had been ingrained, practiced until they were second nature. Here she was adrift. Before she could voice her uncertainty, Leah was scrambling down from the wagon. "I can start a fire, Mother," she said, her voice tight but determined. Silas paused, watching the girl. He gave a slight nod. "There's dry wood under that rock ledge," he said, pointing. "The kindling is best near the base of the pines." He did not offer to do it for her. He simply gave her the knowledge she needed, a small but significant gesture of respect for her capability. Alara climbed down, her limbs stiff. She helped Mara and Cora, their small faces pale in the fading light. Silas was tending to his horse, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur that was more gentle than any words he had yet offered a human. He moved with a quiet competence that was almost mesmerizing. He built no grand fire, just a small, contained one that gave off surprising heat. He produced a pot, a slab of bacon, and a sack of cornmeal from a crate in the wagon. The smell of frying bacon soon filled the cool night air, a scent so ordinary, so comforting, that it made Alara's throat tighten. He cooked without fuss, then dished the simple meal onto tin plates, handing one to each of them. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the tall pines. For the first time in days, Alara felt a warmth that was not born of fear or anger. It was the simple warmth of a hot meal and a fire. When they were finished, Silas took the plates and cleaned them with a handful of dirt and a cloth, another task performed with that same unthinking competence. He then laid out bedrolls for them near the fire, and one for himself on the other side of the wagon. He was creating a space for them, a boundary of safety. As her daughters settled into a restless sleep, Alara sat staring into the flames. The man across the fire was still a mystery, his thoughts hidden behind a stoic mask. But he had offered them food. He had offered them warmth. He had offered them a respectful distance. It was more than she had received from her own family. The fear had not vanished, but for the first time, a tiny, fragile seed of something else began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was not yet trust, but it was the quiet hope that she had not made a catastrophic mistake. The ranch was nestled in a wide, shallow valley, cradled by hills forested with pine and aspen. It was not a place of gentle beauty. The land was stark, rugged, and uncompromising, much like the man who owned it. The main house was a sturdy, unadorned structure of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney at one end and a deep porch along the front. A short distance away stood a large barn, a corral, and a smaller cabin, which Silas indicated was for them. From the outside, the cabin looked almost derelict, but as Alara pushed open the heavy plank door, she found it surprisingly sound. The single room was larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 benches, and 2 built-in bunks against the far wall. The floor was swept clean, and a pile of freshly split firewood was stacked neatly by the hearth. There was no dust, no sign of neglect. It was a space of stark functionality, stripped of all sentiment, but it was solid, and it was theirs. "The well is behind the main house," Silas said from the doorway, his large frame filling the opening. "There's a spring up the creek for colder water. The outhouse is past the woodpile. I'll bring over some supplies." He did not linger. He stated the facts and then retreated, leaving them to the echoing silence of their new life. The first few days were a study in dislocation. Alara and her daughters moved like ghosts through the unfamiliar space, their actions tentative, their voices hushed. The sheer, overwhelming silence of the valley was a constant presence. Back on the farm, there had always been the sounds of neighbors, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of a passing cart. Here, the only sounds were the wind in the trees, the cry of a hawk, and the rhythmic, distant thud of Silas's axe. He was a constant, tireless worker. From before dawn until after dusk, he was in motion, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, chopping wood, repairing harnesses. He moved with a relentless, solitary purpose, a man who had made peace with endless labor. Alara watched him from the cabin window, feeling a deep and unsettling sense of uselessness. She was a woman defined by her work, by the rhythm of seasons and chores. Here she had no purpose. She was a guest, a charity case, and the feeling chafed at her pride until it was raw. The supplies Silas brought were basic but plentiful. Sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, a slab of salt pork, coffee, and a small tin of precious sugar. He left them on their small porch without a word, a silent offering that was both a kindness and a reinforcement of her dependency. Her daughters reacted to the change in their own ways. Leah, ever practical, immediately set about making the cabin a home. She unpacked their linens, arranged their few belongings, and took over the cooking with a grim determination. But at night, Alara would hear her crying softly into her pillow. Mara retreated further into herself, spending hours staring out at the unforgiving hills, her sketchbook lying untouched in her lap. It was Cora who adapted most quickly. The initial fear gave way to a child's boundless curiosity. She watched Silas from a safe distance, her head tilted like a small bird's, fascinated by his quiet competence with the animals. One afternoon, Alara saw him stop his work and watch as Cora tried to befriend a wary barn cat. He said nothing, but a few hours later, a small saucer of milk appeared on the porch steps. Cora was delighted. Alara understood the gesture. He was a man who communicated through action, not words. The silence between their cabin and his house was a vast, uncharted territory. She felt she ought to thank him, to speak to him, but the words would not form. What could she say? Thank you for saving us from a life of servitude? Thank you for not being the monster we feared? The sentiments were too large, too fraught, to be contained in simple words. So she remained silent, and he did the same. But idleness was a poison to her soul. On the fourth day, she could bear it no longer. She found a pile of his work shirts in a basket on his porch, torn and frayed. Without asking, she took them back to the cabin. She spent the entire day with her needle and thread, her hands finding solace in the familiar, meticulous work. She patched the elbows, reinforced the seams, and resewn buttons. Her stitches were small and neat, a testament to a lifetime of making things last. When she was finished, she folded them and placed the mended pile back in the basket on his porch. The next morning, the basket was gone. In its place was a pail of fresh, warm milk, still steaming in the cool morning air. No words were exchanged. None were needed. A silent transaction had occurred. It was not payment. It was an acknowledgement. A few days later, she noticed a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin that caught the morning sun. It was choked with weeds, but the soil looked dark and rich. An idea, the first spark of purpose she'd felt in weeks, took hold. She spent the afternoon clearing it, her hands digging into the soil, pulling up stubborn roots, feeling the familiar burn in her muscles. Leah came to help, her earlier moroseness replaced by a flicker of interest. They worked together, mother and daughter, the shared labor a balm to their frayed nerves. The following day, leaning against the cabin wall, was a spade and a hoe, their wooden handles worn smooth with use, their metal heads cleaned of any rust. Beside them was a small cloth sack. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, and hardy greens. Alara looked toward the barn where Silas was working, his back to her. He had seen her. He had understood. He had provided the tools. A current of something warm and unfamiliar passed through her. He was not just giving them shelter. He was giving her back a piece of herself. He was allowing her to put down roots, however small, in this hard, unyielding ground. He was letting her work. And in doing so, he was giving her back her dignity. The rhythm of their lives began to settle, taking its shape not from a clock or a calendar, but from the sun and the work that needed doing. Alara rose before dawn, the chill of the mountain air a sharp awakening. While Leah prepared their simple breakfast, Alara would walk to the main house to collect the milk Silas left for them. The exchange was always the same. She would leave a basket on his porch, containing mended clothes, a loaf of freshly baked bread, or jars of wild berry preserves she and the girls had gathered. And in the morning the basket would be gone, replaced by the pail of milk, a cut of meat, or a clutch of eggs. This silent barter became the foundation of their strange, unspoken arrangement. It was a partnership built on necessity and mutual respect for labor, a language of deeds that suited them both better than words. Alara's garden began to thrive under her patient care. The first tender green shoots pushing through the dark soil felt like a personal victory, a defiant act of creation in a place that had seemed so barren. Mara, seeing the tangible results of the work, began to emerge from her shell. She helped Alara weed and water, her hands, once dedicated to delicate pencil drawings, growing stronger and more capable. Even Cora found her place, her small, nimble fingers perfect for hunting down beetles and other pests that threatened their burgeoning crop. One afternoon, as Alara worked in the garden, she felt Silas's presence before she saw him. She looked up to find him standing at the edge of the patch, watching her. He held a length of rope in his hands. He did not say hello. He simply pointed with his chin toward the encroaching forest. "Deer will come for the bean shoots," he said. It was the longest sentence he had strung together in her presence. Alara straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "I know. I was planning to build a scarecrow." He gave a slow shake of his head. "A scarecrow won't stop a hungry doe." He walked to the edge of the garden and began driving stakes into the ground with the back of an axe he carried on his belt. He worked with his usual quiet intensity, and Alara watched, unsure of what to do. Leah came out of the cabin, drawn by the sound. Together, they watched as he expertly strung the rope between the stakes, creating a makeshift fence. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several small, tin bells. He tied them at intervals along the rope. "It's not much," he said, his gaze fixed on his work. "But the sound will spook them at night." He finished his task and stood back to inspect it. The little bells tinkled softly in the breeze. It was a simple, practical solution, but it was more than that. It was an act of foresight, of protection for something she had built. It was his work joining hers. "Thank you, Silas," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. In that brief glance, she saw not pity, but something that looked like approval. It was a small thing, but it settled in her chest like a warm stone. The garden became a bridge between their two silent worlds. He would leave tools he thought she might need. She would leave a share of her harvest on his porch. They were building something together, side by side, even as they remained separated by the vast expanse of their individual solitudes. One evening, as a storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray, Alara noticed the roof of their cabin was leaking. A steady drip began to fall near the hearth, splashing onto the stone. Leah rushed to place a pot underneath it. The leak was small, but the storm was growing, the wind howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. Alara's heart sank. A leaking roof was a sign of decay, a reminder of their precarious position. The next morning, the sky was scrubbed clean and the air smelled of rain and pine. When Alara stepped outside, she saw Silas on the roof of their cabin. He was working methodically, replacing split wooden shingles with new ones he had evidently cut himself. He moved across the slanted roof with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, his hammer blows echoing in the quiet morning. She felt a surge of gratitude so strong it made her dizzy. He had not waited for her to ask. He had seen the problem and he had fixed it. She went back inside and put a pot of coffee on the fire. When it was done, She poured a cup, added a spoonful of their precious sugar, and carried it outside. She stood at the bottom of the ladder that was propped against the cabin, looking up. "Silas," she called out. He paused, looking down at her, his face unreadable in the morning light. "I brought you coffee." He considered her for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, he made his way down the ladder. He took the offered cup, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers. The contact sent a small jolt through her, a startling reminder of the physical distance they always maintained. He drank the coffee standing there, his gaze moving over the valley, over the hills that held his home. He seemed to be a part of the landscape, as rugged and enduring as the ancient pines. "The shingles on the west side were starting to rot," he said, as if explaining an obvious fact of nature, like the sun rising. "The winter storms are hard in this valley." "I am grateful," she said simply. He finished the coffee and handed the empty cup back to her. "A house needs a sound roof," he replied. He then turned and climbed back up the ladder to finish his work. Alara stood there for a long time, the warm cup still in her hands. A house needs a sound roof. He was not just patching a leak. He was reinforcing their shelter. He was making their home safer, more permanent. He was, in his own quiet way, telling her that they belonged here, that they were no longer adrift. The unspoken partnership had been solidified, hammered into place with every nail he drove into their roof. The sickness came on suddenly, as it often did in the high country. One evening, Mara complained of a headache and a chill. By morning, she was burning with a fever that left her delirious, her skin frighteningly hot to the touch. Alara was plunged into a cold sea of terror. It was a fever like the one that had taken her own mother, swift and merciless. She tried all the remedies she knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea, endless spoonfuls of water to ward off dehydration. But the fever only climbed, and Mara's weak moans tore at Alara's heart. Leah sat by her sister's side, her face pale and strained, while Cora hovered in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Alara felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The valley, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now seemed like a trap, its isolation a deadly threat. The nearest doctor was a full day's ride away, a journey they could not possibly make. For 2 days, Alara did not sleep. She watched her daughter toss and turn, her mind a frantic whirl of prayers and desperate hopes. On the third morning, when Mara's breathing became shallow and ragged, a numbing despair began to set in. She was losing her. She was going to lose her daughter in this isolated cabin, far from everything she had ever known. She was standing on the porch, staring blindly at the mountains, when Silas appeared. He must have seen the lack of smoke from their chimney, the stillness around the cabin. He took in her haggard appearance, the raw fear in her eyes, and seemed to understand immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "It's Mara," Alara whispered, her voice breaking. "A fever. I don't know what else to do." He did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. He acted. "Keep her warm, but not smothered. And keep forcing water into her, even if it's just a drop at a time." He turned and strode away toward the forest that bordered the creek. Alara watched him go, a fragile, desperate hope warring with her despair. He was a man of the mountains. Perhaps he knew things she did not. An hour later, he returned, his hands full of roots and leaves she did not recognize. He came into the cabin, his large presence seeming to shrink the small space. Yet it was not an intrusion. It was an anchoring force. He ignored the mess, the sense of panic, and went straight to the hearth. He crushed the roots with the handle of his knife and added them, along with some of the leaves, to a small pot of water he set to boil. The air filled with a pungent, earthy scent. "Yarrow will break the fever," he explained, his voice calm and steady as he worked. "The root is for the congestion in her chest." He showed Alara how to steep the mixture and how to administer it, a spoonful at a time. Then he took a handful of the remaining leaves, mashed them into a pulp, and wrapped them in a piece of clean cloth. "A poultice," he said, placing it gently on Mara's chest. It will help her breathe. He worked with a quiet, focused competence that was profoundly calming. He was not a doctor, but he was a man who understood survival, who knew the secrets of the land. He had not asked permission to enter their home or their crisis. He had simply seen a need and met it. Throughout the long day and into the night, they worked together. Alara administered the tea while Silas kept the fire going. His steady presence a silent vigil. He did not hover, but he was always there, a solid, reassuring shadow in the corner of the room. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to give a quiet instruction or to ask a practical question. For the first time, they were not communicating through barter or observation, but through a shared, urgent purpose. They were allies in a battle for Mara's life. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, the fever broke. Alara felt the change immediately. The searing heat under her palm lessened, and a fine sheen of sweat appeared on Mara's brow. Her breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. A choked sob of relief escaped Alara's lips. She looked across the dimly lit room at Silas, who was watching from his seat by the fire. His face was cast in shadow, but she could see the tension leave his shoulders. He gave a single, slow nod. The crisis had passed. He stayed until the sun was fully up, ensuring Mara was sleeping peacefully, her color returning. He got up to leave, and Alara followed him to the door. The cool morning air felt like a benediction. "I don't know how to thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. He paused on the porch, turning to look at her. The morning sun caught the gray in his eyes, revealing a depth of weariness, of old sorrow, that she had never seen so clearly before. "No thanks needed," he said gruffly. "Fever. It takes what it wants. Sometimes you can stop it." The way he said it, the faint tremor in his voice, made her understand. He was not just talking about Mara. He was talking about his own wife, his own child, the family the town whispered he had lost to sickness. He was speaking from a place of profound and intimate knowledge of grief. In that moment, he was no longer just the stoic rancher, the mysterious outsider. He was a man who understood loss in its most brutal form. He had fought for her daughter with a ferocity born from his own past tragedy. He had shared not just his knowledge, but his own vulnerability, his own scars. The wall of silence and solitude he had built around himself had a door, and he had just opened it for her, just a crack. As he walked back toward his house, Alara leaned against the doorframe, her legs weak. The fear and exhaustion remained, but they were now layered with something new. A deep, resonant, and unwavering trust. The weeks that followed Mara's recovery marked a subtle but profound shift in the valley's atmosphere. The invisible line between the main house and the cabin seemed to dissolve, eroded by the shared crisis. Silas no longer left supplies on the porch like a shy offering. Instead, he would bring them to the door. Sometimes he would linger for a moment, exchanging a few words with Alara about the weather or the state of the fences. Their conversations were never long or deeply personal, but they were a start, the first green shoots of a camaraderie that had taken root in the dark soil of their shared ordeal. Alara, in turn, found herself growing bolder. She began to see the entire ranch not as his property and her small corner, but as a single, functioning whole that they were both a part of. She noticed the way he often skipped a midday meal, working straight through until dusk. One day, she wrapped a portion of their lunch, stew and fresh bread, in a cloth and carried it out to the far pasture where he was resetting a line of fence posts. He stopped his work, surprised as she approached. He took the offering without a word, but she saw the flicker of gratitude in his eyes. They ate in a comfortable silence, sitting on a sun-warmed boulder, the valley spread out below them. "The cattle are looking strong," she commented, breaking the quiet. He chewed his bread thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping over the small herd. "Good grass this year," he replied. "The winter will be the test. You think it will be a hard one?" "The aspens turned early," he said, pointing to a splash of brilliant gold on the opposite hillside. "And the pine cones are tight. The land tells you what's coming, If you know how to listen, Ilara realized that was what he was always doing. Listening. He listened to the wind, to the animals, to the changing seasons. His silence was not emptiness. It was a state of deep and constant observation. This quiet communion became a regular occurrence. She would bring him his meal, and they would share a few minutes of rest and sparse conversation. He began to speak more freely in these moments, not about himself, but about the land he knew so intimately. He taught her to identify the tracks of a mountain lion, to know which clouds carried rain and which were just for show, to understand the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a change in the weather. He was sharing his knowledge, his world, with her. Her daughters, too, were finding their own places in this new life. Leah's fierce protectiveness had softened into a quiet competence. She had taken over the management of their cabin stores with a seriousness that belied her age. Mara, fully recovered, began to draw again. But instead of the sad, lonely figures that had filled her old sketchbooks, she now drew the landscape. The rugged peaks, the ancient pines, the hawk that circled overhead. Her art was no longer an escape, but an engagement with the world around her. And Cora, fearless Cora, had appointed herself Silas's shadow. She followed him on his chores, chattering away, asking endless questions which he answered with surprising patience. Ilara would watch them from a distance, the huge, silent man and the small, inquisitive girl, and a warmth would spread through her chest. He was gentle with her, showing her how to feed the chickens without getting pecked and letting her sit on the fence to watch him work with the horses. He was giving her daughter a sense of safety and stability that Ilara, on her own, had feared she could never provide. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ilara was mending a tear in one of Cora's dresses on the cabin porch. Silas was in the corral, working with a young, unbroken colt. It was a beautiful, powerful animal, all nervous energy and flashing hooves. He was not trying to break its spirit with force, as she had seen other men do. Instead, he moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, speaking to the horse in a low, steady murmur. It was a dance of patience and trust, the man and the animal learning each other's boundaries. He was teaching it not to fear his hand. Ilara found herself mesmerized by the sight. The strength he held in check, the immense patience he displayed. It was the same quiet force he had used to earn her trust, to mend their broken lives. He was not a man of grand gestures or eloquent speeches. He was a man of steadfast presence, of quiet capability, of unspoken promises kept. A sense of peace settled over her, so profound it was almost startling. The shame that had clung to her for years, the feeling of being a failure, had been burned away by the clean fire of honest work and mutual respect. Here, in this valley, she was not Abram's barren widow. She was Ilara, a mother, a gardener, partner. Her worth was measured not by the sons she had failed to produce, but by the strength in her hands and the resilience of her spirit. She looked from the man in the corral to the smoke curling from her own chimney, to her daughters playing by the creek. She thought of Gideon's cruel words at the funeral, his pronouncement that her life was over. He had been wrong. Her life was not over. It had simply been waiting all this time to truly begin. The peace of the valley was shattered by the arrival of a rider. Ilara was hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines when she heard the horse, its gait unfamiliar and hurried. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Visitors were an anomaly in their isolated world. A man crested the ridge and rode down into the valley, his posture stiff and self-important. As he drew closer, Ilara's blood ran cold. It was Gideon. He reined in his horse, his eyes sweeping over the scene with undisguised contempt. The tidy cabin, the flourishing garden, the laundry line with its patched but clean clothes. His gaze landed on Ilara, and his lips curled into a sneer. "So, this is the palace the brute has given you," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "It seems you've made yourself quite at home." Ilara's first instinct was to shrink back, to feel the old shame rise like bile in her throat. But then she straightened her spine. The woman who stood before him now was not the same broken widow he had cast out months ago. She had been forged anew in the silence and solitude of these mountains. "What do you want, Gideon?" she asked, her voice steady, devoid of the fear he expected. Her calmness seemed to infuriate him. He dismounted, his movements jerky and aggressive. What do I want? I've come to save my brother's children from this disgrace. The whole town is talking. My sister-in-law, living in sin with an outcast, raising her daughters in a godless wilderness. We are not living in sin, Elara said, her voice like ice. We are living with dignity. Something you know nothing about. Just then, Leah and Mara emerged from the cabin, their faces etched with alarm. Cora, who had been playing near the woodpile, ran to Elara's side and clung to her skirt. Gideon's eyes lit up with a cruel sort of triumph as he saw the girls. The town council agrees with me, he announced, puffing out his chest. A woman of your questionable morals is not a fit guardian. As their only male relative, I am petitioning for custody of my nieces. They will be raised in a proper Christian home, the world tilted on its axis. He was trying to take her children. The threat was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that for a moment Elara could not breathe. This was his true purpose. It wasn't about her morals. It was about control, about punishing her for her defiance. And perhaps he saw the girls as future assets, to be married off for his own gain. You will not take them, Elara said, the words a low, guttural growl. She pushed Cora behind her, her body a shield. They are my daughters. They are Abram's daughters. Gideon shot back. And they bear his name, a name you have dragged through the mud. You have no legal standing here, Elara. You are a squatter on this man's land. A court will see that. At that moment, Silas emerged from the barn, drawn by the sound of angry voices. He moved not with haste, but with a deliberate, lethal calm. He carried a heavy axe in one hand, its blade gleaming in the afternoon sun. He did not brandish it as a weapon, but simply held it at his side, its presence a stark and menacing fact. He stopped beside Elara, his sheer size and stony silence a stark contrast to Gideon's agitated posturing. This is private land, Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very ground. You're trespassing. Gideon, though clearly intimidated, tried to hold his ground. This is a family matter, Cole. It doesn't concern you? You are on my property, threatening this family, Silas stated, his gray eyes locking onto Gideon's. That makes it my concern. He took a single, deliberate step forward. This is her home, Gideon faltered, taking an involuntary step back. He had come expecting to bully a frightened, helpless woman. He was not prepared for this man, this mountain, who stood immovably in his path. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Gideon was an intruder here, a creature of noise and bluster in a world of quiet strength. The law is on my side, Gideon blustered, his voice losing its conviction. I will have the sheriff? The sheriff knows me. Silas cut in, his voice dangerously soft. He knows I don't take kindly to trespassers. And he knows this valley is a long way from town. The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. The isolation that Elara had once feared had now become her greatest defense. Gideon was out of his element, and he knew it. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to Elara's defiant one, and finally at the three girls huddled behind their mother. He saw no fear in them, only a united front. He had lost, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury. You will burn for this, Elara, he spat, his final parting shot. Both of you. He yanked his horse's reins, clambered clumsily into the saddle and rode away, his retreat as undignified as his arrival had been arrogant. They stood in silence, watching until he was a small speck disappearing over the ridge. The quiet of the valley descended once more, but it was a different quiet now, charged with the lingering electricity of the confrontation. The external threat had breached their sanctuary, but it had not broken them. Instead, it had revealed the true strength of the foundation they had built. Elara looked at Silas, at the man who had just stood for her, who had declared her place in the world with 3 simple words. This is her home. He had faced down her past and vanquished it, not with violence, but with the sheer, undeniable weight of his conviction. The promise he had made at the graveside so many months ago had just been renewed, forged in fire and made unbreakable. The echo of Gideon's horse's hooves faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier, more profound, than before. Alara's body trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline. Her arms were wrapped tightly around Cora, while Leah and Mara stood close, their presence a warm, solid comfort. She looked up at Silas. He was still standing there, the axe held loosely in his hand, his gaze fixed on the ridge where Gideon had disappeared. His profile was as stern and unyielding as the granite cliffs that bordered the valley. He had been her shield, her fortress. He had stood between her and the world that sought to condemn her, and he had not flinched. The gratitude she felt was a living thing, a powerful current that rose from the depths of her soul. It was a feeling too vast for the simple, worn-out words she possessed. "Silas," she began, her voice still shaky. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers. The hardness in them softened as he took in the sight of her and the girls, huddled together but safe. "He's gone," Silas said, stating the obvious. But the words were meant as a reassurance, a final closing of the door on the threat. He leaned the axe against the cabin wall, the gesture a deliberate setting aside of the confrontation, a return to peace. "He won't be back. How can you be so sure?" Leah asked, her voice tight with worry. "Men like him are predators," Silas answered, his gaze still on Alara. "They prey on what they think is weak. When they find strength, they run." The implication was clear. He had seen her strength, long before she had fully recognized it in herself. He had not saved a damsel in distress. He had reinforced a fellow survivor. Alara felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with fear or shame. "He said he would get the law," she murmured, the old anxieties still whispering at the edges of her mind. "The law in these parts is a practical thing," Silas said, a hint of a wry, almost invisible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It's concerned with horse thieves and claim jumpers, not petty family squabbles. Gideon has no claim on you, and less on your children. You are not his property, and this is my land. His power ends where my property line begins." It was a declaration of sovereignty, not just for him, but for her as well. Within the bounds of this valley, she was free. The world's judgment could not reach her here. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Alara sat at the table, mending a shirt by the light of a single lamp, but her hands were still, her mind elsewhere. A soft knock came at the door. It was Silas. He held a small, carved wooden bird in his hand. "For Cora," he said, his voice quiet. "I saw how he frightened her. I made this for her." The bird was simple but exquisitely detailed, the wood grain smooth and polished. It was an act of such unexpected tenderness that it stole her breath. She took the bird, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to." "I know." He did not leave. He stood in the doorway, a large, silent presence silhouetted against the deepening twilight. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. "Alara," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was both strange and deeply familiar. "What Gideon said about us," he trailed off, a rare uncertainty clouding his features. He was a man who could face down an armed threat without blinking, but the nuances of reputation and rumor seemed to discomfit him. "He spoke with a poisoned tongue," she finished for him, her voice firm. "His words have no meaning here. It matters what people say," he countered quietly. "It matters for you." For the girls, she looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw past the stoic rancher to the man beneath. A man who had lived with the town's whispers and suspicions for years. A man who understood the weight of being judged. And she saw that his concern was not for himself, but for her. He was worried that his protection, his association with her, would bring her more harm than good. A fierce wave of protectiveness rose in her, an impulse to defend him as he had defended her. "The only words that matter to me are the ones spoken with honesty," she said, her gaze unwavering. "The town's gossip?" Gideon's lies? They are like the wind. They make a lot of noise, but they can't knock down a house with a strong foundation. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to find what he was looking for. A measure of the tension he held in his broad shoulders seemed to release. "You are not what they say you are, Silas Cole," she continued, the words coming from a place of deep conviction. "You are a good man." He looked away then, toward the dark mountains, as if her direct praise was a light too bright to bear. When he looked back, his expression was unguarded, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "My wife, Sarah. She used to say I was born 100 years too late," he said, his voice a low murmur. That I didn't have the words for the modern world. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her name. It felt like a sacred offering, a piece of his locked-away heart. "Some things don't need words," Elara said softly, her hand tightening around the small wooden bird. He held her gaze for another long moment, a universe of understanding passing between them in the quiet dark. Then, with a slight nod, he turned and walked back to his own house, leaving her in the warm lamplight with the scent of pine and the profound, comforting knowledge that she was finally, truly home. Winter descended on the valley not as a gentle blanket, but as a siege. The sky turned the color of lead, and the snows came, deep and relentless, burying the world in a pristine, unforgiving white. The wind howled down from the high peaks, a constant mournful cry that rattled the cabin's lone window and scoured the logs clean. In this stark, elemental world, their lives drew inward, their universe shrinking to the warm, firelit spaces of the cabin, the barn, and the main house. The unspoken partnership between Elara and Silas, forged in the milder seasons, was now tested and tempered by the harsh realities of survival. Their days fell into a new rhythm, dictated by the storm. Silas would spend his mornings clearing paths between the buildings, his powerful form a dark shape against the endless white, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He tended to the cattle in the barn, their warm, earthy scent a welcome reprieve from the sterile cold. Elara and the girls, meanwhile, turned the cabin into a hub of domestic industry. They baked bread, the yeasty aroma filling the small space with life. They mended clothes, their needles flashing in the firelight. They rendered tallow for candles and soap, ensuring they would have light and warmth to last through the darkest months. Mara read aloud to them from their few precious books, her voice a steady anchor in the howling gales, while Cora, her new wooden bird a constant companion, drew pictures on a slate with a piece of charcoal. There were days when the snow was so thick they could not see the main house from the cabin. On these days, the isolation felt immense, as if they were the only people left in the world. Yet, Elara did not feel the terror that such a thought would have once inspired. The fear had been replaced by a quiet confidence in their preparedness, in Silas's competence, and in her own. They were a self-contained unit, a small island of warmth and life in a frozen sea. Their communication, once sparse, now became a daily necessity. Every evening, Silas would come to the cabin, ostensibly to bring more firewood, but he would linger. He and Elara would stand by the hearth, discussing the dwindling hay stores, the state of the roof under its heavy load of snow, the signs of a break in the weather. These were the conversations of true partners, their concerns intertwined, their fates bound together by the shared responsibility for the lives, both human and animal, in their care. One night, the storm reached a fever pitch. The wind shrieked with a terrifying, human-like voice, and a heavy branch, weighted with ice, crashed onto the cabin roof with a sound like a thunderclap. The girls cried out in fear. Elara calmed them, her own heart pounding, and then she heard a knock at the door, so loud it was more of a banging. She opened it to find Silas there, covered in snow, a lantern in his hand. "The big pine by the creek has fallen," he said, his voice grim. "It took part of the barn roof with it. The cattle are spooked." He did not ask for help, but she knew he needed it. "Leah, stay with your sisters. Keep the fire high," Elara commanded, pulling on her heavy coat and wrapping a shawl around her head. She followed Silas into the blinding storm, the wind tearing at her, the snow so deep it came past her knees. The world was a chaotic swirl of white and roaring noise. The barn was a scene of controlled chaos. A huge section of the roof had collapsed, letting in the snow and the wind. The cattle were lowing in terror, their eyes wide in the swaying lantern light. Without a word, they set to work. Silas, with his immense strength, began clearing the heavy, snow-laden debris, while Alara moved among the animals, her voice calm and soothing, her hands gentle, calming them one by one. She brought them fresh hay, her familiar presence a steadying influence in their panic. They worked for hours, side by side in the frigid darkness, a silent, efficient team. They were cold, exhausted, and covered in snow, but they moved with a shared rhythm, each anticipating the other's needs. They managed to herd the cattle into the undamaged section of the barn and secure a heavy tarpaulin over the gaping hole in the roof. When the immediate danger had passed, they stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the barn, their breath ragged clouds in the cold air. "The rest can wait until morning," Silas said, his shoulders slumping with fatigue. Alara looked at his face in the lantern light. It was etched with weariness, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. A deep, elemental feeling rose within her, something more profound than gratitude or trust. It was a fierce, protective wave of connection, a recognition of this man who had become the center of her new world. "Come inside," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let me make you some coffee. You can't go back to a cold house." He looked as if he might refuse, his habit of solitude a powerful instinct. But then he looked at her, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and he nodded. Back in the cabin, the girls were asleep, huddled together for warmth. Alara stoked the fire and put the coffee pot on to boil. Silas sat at the table, his large frame seeming to fill the cozy space. He looked out of place and yet perfectly right. She brought him a cup of hot, strong coffee and sat down opposite him. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the abating howl of the wind outside. The storm had broken them, but it had also broken the last of the walls between them. "This life," she said softly, looking at her worn hands resting on the table. "It's harder than any I've known. But I have never felt stronger." He looked at her, his gray eyes deep and serious in the warm light. "Strength isn't about having an easy life," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's about what you build when life is hard." They sat in a comfortable silence, the shared warmth of the fire, the coffee, and their mutual understanding a palpable presence in the room. The storm outside had passed. The storm inside Alara's heart, the one that had raged for years with shame and fear, was finally, irrevocably, still. She was home. Spring arrived as a promise whispered on a warmer wind. The snows receded, first from the south-facing slopes and then from the valley floor, revealing a world washed clean and new. The creek, swollen with meltwater, roared with life, and the first green shoots of wild grass pushed through the damp, dark earth. The change in season mirrored the transformation within Alara herself. The woman who had survived the winter was not the same one who had arrived in the valley the previous fall. The lines of fear and uncertainty on her face had been replaced by a quiet confidence. Her shoulders were straighter, her gaze direct. She moved with a sense of purpose, a deep-seated knowledge of her own capability and worth. The ranch, too, was reawakening. The damaged barn roof was their first project. They worked together, Silas handling the heavy beams and framework while Alara and Leah, surprisingly adept, helped with the shingling. There was an easy rhythm to their shared labor now, punctuated by comfortable silences and brief, practical conversations. One afternoon, as they sat on the newly repaired roof, taking a rest and surveying the valley below, Silas turned to her. "Gideon sold your husband's farm," he said without preamble. "Heard it in town when I went for supplies." Alara absorbed the news. A few months ago, it would have felt like the final nail in the coffin of her old life, a painful severing. Now it was just information. The farm, with its painful memories and public humiliations, felt like a place from someone else's story. "Does it bother you?" Silas asked, his eyes studying her face. She thought for a moment, looking at the vibrant green of the valley, at the sturdy cabin that was her home, at her daughters, who were down by the creek, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "No," she said, and was surprised by the simple truth of it. "My life is here now." Her words hung in the clean spring air between them. It was a declaration, an affirmation of everything they had built. Silas gave a slow nod, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He had offered her a home, and she had truly taken it, not as a refugee, but as a homesteader of her own destiny. As the days grew longer and warmer, their partnership deepened into an easy domesticity. They planned the season's work together, their discussions ranging from which fields to plant to how to reinforce the corral. Alara's garden, twice the size of the previous years, became a vital source of food for them all, and she took pride in the neat, productive rows. He no longer left tools for her as silent offerings. Instead, he would simply ask, "Do you need the good hoe today?" She, in turn, no longer left meals on his porch but would call him in for dinner, and he would come, sitting at their table as if it were his own. He was no longer a mysterious benefactor, and she was no longer a charity case. They were a family, forged not by blood or by law, but by the shared crucible of hardship, labor, and mutual respect. One evening, Alara stood on the cabin porch, watching the last rays of sun paint the western peaks in shades of rose and gold. The air was soft and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and new pine needles. The girls were inside, their quiet chatter a comforting murmur. Silas came and stood beside her, leaning against a porch post. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the colors fade from the sky. "I never thought I'd see this land come alive like this again," he said, his voice low and reflective. "After Sarah and my boy, I just worked. It's all I knew how to do. I was just waiting for the seasons to turn, for my own time to be done." Alara's heart ached for the years of solitary grief he had endured. "And now?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her, and his weathered face was illuminated by the soft twilight. The look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. Not gratitude, not respect, but something deeper, more tender. "Now," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I find myself looking forward to the spring." The simple confession was more powerful than any grand declaration. It was an admission of hope, a testament to the life she and her daughters had brought back to his lonely valley. He had saved her from a life of shame and servitude, but she, in turn, had saved him from a life of hollow solitude. She thought back to that desperate day at the graveside, to the stranger who had looked at her with clear, unpitying eyes and made a promise. "I will take you home." He had kept his word, in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. Home was not the small, clean cabin. It was not the rugged, beautiful land. Home was this feeling of peace, this sense of belonging. It was the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. It was the sight of her daughters, thriving and happy. It was the steady, reassuring presence of the good man standing beside her. The last light faded from the sky, and the first stars began to appear in the vast, velvet darkness. Alara breathed in the cool night air, her heart full. The past was a ghost, and the future was an open trail, but for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the journey.